Welcome everyone to the webinar titled Free Trade Agreements, question and answer session. Today's webinar is sponsored by Scarborough University. ScarU was founded in 2006 with a mission to provide necessary, relevant, and continuing education to Scarborough employees, clients, and professionals engaged in international and domestic trade and logistics. My name is Kevin Ekstrand. I'm a licensed customs broker, certified customs specialist, and I have the privilege of being Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Scarborough International. It's an honor to be with you today. This is an interactive webinar, as all our webinars are, and we are here to answer your questions, so please submit questions. You will find the Q&A button at the top of your screen. Your questions will appear for the audience to see, so you may choose to show your name or be anonymous. I ask that you start submitting your questions right now. Many of you submitted questions at the time you registered, and we do have those questions, and we'll try to get to those first. Please also note that you can easily adjust your windows. Please click on the top of the video portion to maximize or minimize this piece of the webinar so you can see the few slides that we will be showing today. So while you're adjusting your screens and posting your questions, I'll take a minute to introduce you to Scarborough. Scarborough is a full-service logistics company that has been operating for over 31 years. We're headquartered in the heart of America, Kansas City, where faith, family, and hard work make for a great organization. We also have offices in Chicago, St. Louis, Des Moines, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, Shanghai, China, Dallas, Texas, and New York, New York. We also have beyond our own offices, we are part of a network of companies that puts us in every country around the world. In other words, we are going to take great care of you. We are truly a great partner to our clients. We collaborate, stand by their side, and actively participate in their growth opportunities by helping them navigate import and export regulation around the world. We value each and every partnership, along with each and every relationship we build along the way. As always, I'd like to thank each of you for being here today. To our many clients on this call today, thank you for your partnership. If you are not yet a Scarborough client, we welcome an opportunity to earn your trust and partnership. Now let me introduce you to my good friend and the presenter here today, Mr. Adam Hill. Adam is a licensed customs broker, certified customs specialist, certified export specialist, and an MBA. Adam sits on the Trade Support Network for U.S. Customs and Border Protection as well. We're pleased to have Adam as our Vice President of Operations for both Scarborough International and Scarborough to Mexico. And as we dive into free trade agreements today, there's numerous free trade agreements. We can't go into every single one of them. We're going to talk probably a lot in generalities, and as it relates to the admissibility and entrance and or movement of products in and out of countries, what you need to look for, and the liabilities of using and declaring free trade agreements. So I'll turn it over to Adam to start. So Adam.
Thanks, Kevin. Like Kevin said, please make sure you guys start sending your questions in as you think of them. We will do our best to answer all of them towards the end. We'll try to keep the presentation portion down as short as possible in order to get all, or at least as many of your questions as we can answered during this time. So real quick about free trade agreements, what are some of the benefits? Obviously, they allow you, one, on the import side, to most of the time import your product from certain countries duty-free, or at least at a reduced duty rate. It also allows you to export your products into those same countries with the same reciprocal benefit that the U.S. Receives on the import side. Your customers for an export company would also receive on their side. So, that, in my mind, that's one of the big positives of free trade agreements in general. They do help protect some U.S. interests. And I think from my perspective, free trade agreements do a lot of good. They don't always get the best rap when it comes to the news or when it comes to politics today, but I think overall they allow the United States to compete in other markets much easier than we could without them because of some of the high duty rates and high tariffs that we see in other countries for products. So As of January 1, 2015, we put 2015 because that's really the last time that we've had really any update. So we have 20 countries currently inside of here. We have Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, and then CAFTA, which is Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Israel, Jordan, Korea, Morocco. NAFTA is obviously Canada and Mexico, Oman, Panama, Peru, and Singapore. The one that people are going to be like, well, you didn't have it up there is GSP. GSP is called the Generalized System of Preferences. It's not necessarily considered a free trade agreement. It acts for the most part in a very similar way as free trade agreements do. There are a lot of benefits to that, but one of the differences you kind of see there, and I'm sure some of you have seen this, in the past 5 years, GSP has gone away twice and then been retroactively reinstated. So that's one of the big differences in my mind that you see with GSP. It is definitely a benefit, but we have seen that benefit leave, cost our clients cash and duties, and then potentially get them all back. So to me, that's one of the reasons why GSP doesn't really fall into this list. GSP takes into account, I want to say, probably right around 30 to 40 countries altogether. So it is definitely a large group, but it's something that we can't actually call a free trade agreement. You will notice that these are in blue, and there's a few other places. We do have all of these hyperlinks, so when we're done with this presentation will come out, and we'll be able to, you'll be able to click on one of these, and it'll take you to a site that has a little bit more specific information if there's one that you are very curious about. So there are a couple that are under negotiation. One is the TPP. We've heard a ton about that in the news, any of you that follow politics. The TPP has been battered and beaten and everything else. We've done a webinar on the TPP, I think 2 months ago or so. Had a great turnout for that. There's also the TTIP, which is the transatlantic one. So there's definitely some work in progress as far as opening up additional free trade agreements and opening up additional opportunities for U.S. companies to both export into new markets duty-free or import from markets where you're currently paying duty, which will either boost your own bottom line or allow you to compete better because it reduces your landed cost.
I will say something real quick about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you follow international news, and if you attended our TPP webinar that we gave several months ago, where we had the Department of Commerce on the presentation, and that was someone that actually negotiated the TPP from the industrial sector, present with us for that webinar. One of the things that we had that she had kind of predicted that might happen is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership would actually go to Congress, and that it was being highly talked about in Washington, D.C. And as of, I believe it was just a couple days ago, that the president did, in fact, send notice to Congress that he was sending the TPP down for approval. And one of the predictions is that the TPP may, in fact, pass after the election, but before the new president does get sworn in. And based on what we're hearing from the media and those folks in D.C., it's highly likely that still might happen. So we'll see, depending. I mean, we know that the rhetoric on both candidates is negative, or both of the primary candidates. There are more than two. That is negative towards the TPP, but we'll see what actually happens. But it is going to be sent down to Congress to deliberate on. We got that news earlier this week. So,
thank you. There are a couple of things we want to call your attention to. Is there is a tariff tool out there, export.gov, that has a great spot for you to kind of go in, go to export.gov, down you'll see the launch FTA tariff tool, and it'll take you to a site that looks kind of like this. Are you importing goods from, are you exporting to, and then kind of walk through, know your HTS numbers, and this will help you determine some of your products, do they have eligibility or do they not? So a couple of things to kind of talk about here is that textiles tend to be excluded from most free trade agreements. It's something that we see often. So that means that those of you that imports, t-shirts or any kind of other textile, unless the free trade agreement specifically addresses those or was designed around those. One example would be the Haiti Hope Act, that there isn't going to be, textiles tend to be excluded from those. And those of you who import textiles, you're looking at 16 to 32% duty on those. So, that's one of, at least in my opinion, the main reasons. It's also, textiles become some of the most complicated when we start talking about what's the country of origin. Where was the cotton grown? Where was it sewn? Where was it cut to shape? And so we start to really get into the real intricacies of U.S. customs and their rules of origin, which I think is one of the biggest reasons why those tend to stay out of free trade agreements. One of the other things that that we see very common is that you, as, especially if we start talking, if we look at the import side of this, you as an importer, the burden of proof is on you, not your supplier. And now I know we get free trade agreement forms, I know we get country of origin forms from people, but you need to take it another step. And I know it's not, everyone says, well, what am I supposed to do? My supplier gives me this. You need to do your very best to take that one step further and take one more step into the detail of what's going on. The reason for that is, like I said, is that the burden of proof falls on you. So one of the things that we'll see is that you'll get a country of origin certificate, especially if we're looking at like NAFTA, right? And there will be something on there that says screw, and it says it was made in either the U.S. or Canada. Well, customs knows that nuts and bolts and screws, most of them come from the Far East. I would say 95+% of them come from the Far East. So so they're looking for things like that. So also kind of keep that in the back of your head. If you see something that maybe doesn't make sense on that agreement or on the certificate that your supplier has provided you, that you take a step back, ask a question, ask a broker, ask somebody that says, does this make sense to you? Because we see a lot of these that come across as, everything says country of origin something, and we know that there's just no way, or the product is so complicated that there's just no way that it can take into it, that it can be just from that one country. Another issue that we commonly see is you might be taking advantage of a free trade agreement, but your total savings is only $14 a year. Is that $14 worth the burden of proof that you're required to do? One of the things that, for any of you that have an ACE account, which we would highly recommend you get one, and we maybe can talk about that at the very end, is that our consulting group does some analysis on free trade agreements, both ones that you have claimed or areas where you might see that you could have claimed and you didn't. And then that way it will give you an opportunity to look at those values, see, how much am I saving? Maybe I import out of Australia often and we have a free trade agreement, but when the only time I claim it, I'm only saving $14. In my opinion, it's not worth it. Pay the $14. There's no reason to spark interest in your company for a free trade agreement claim for $14. So, and then on the other side, you might see that you're importing a lot of product from Chile and you've never claimed the free trade agreement. Well, maybe that's something you want to talk to your supplier about. Maybe there's hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of customs duty that you are paying every year that you don't need to be paying. And so from our perspective, it's something that you should look at least once a year. There are a couple of reports out there inside of the ACE portal that we can either help you run, or if you just can send us them, our group can do the analysis and give you a good idea of if you're missing anything or if you're claiming those things that just may not be that good. One example that I have seen is, especially when it gets down to like GSP, is we had a customer that was importing items, and luckily for them, they were able to prove that 90+% of the rubber in the world comes from Thailand. But they couldn't go through the entire burden of proof that customs asked them to go to actually say, yes, they can claim GSP. They had to rely on the fact, and that was kind of, I guess you call it their trump card, or their something that came out and said, well, you're right. We can't get all the way through this, but we do know, according to all the statistics out there, that 95, 90+% of the rubber all comes from here. So we can all assume that this is accurate. So be careful there. It is one area, we have a lot of customers that tell us right away, do not claim free trade agreements on any of the products that are coming in. They would much rather, they would much rather take a look and say, does it make sense, rather than claim and not be for sure what's going on.
And this is a specific question as it relates to the Australia Free Trade Agreement from Gina. Thank you, Gina, for submitting the question. You can always, in these webinars, always submit any questions that you want. Like I say, sometimes we're not going to go into all the details of every free trade agreement, but it's there's this question comes by with lots of free trade agreements. Is there any way to issue a blanket, or do they need to have a new certificate of origin for every shipment?
I believe Australia does need to be separate on everyone. So I guess we could take a step back here real quick, is that inside of the tariff book itself, you can get to it online. Those of you who, might have seen the paper version, it's a couple, it's what, a foot thick by the time you set it down. In the beginning of that book is what's called the general notes. Every free trade agreement has its own general note. And inside of those notes, it walks you through what you are and what you aren't capable of doing inside of each one of those free trade agreements. And that's important, because when Kevin talked about we can't go overly detailed about each one, and the reason for that is because every one of these is uniquely different. As a whole free trade agreement, you can make blanket statements like, well, they tend to reduce customs duties, they tend to, or at least mitigate them down some. But we can't make claims like, a tariff shift means this for this country of origin, or now the country of origin is this product, of this product is now Mexico because these three things were done. That might meet a U.S. origin requirement, but maybe not a Chile origin requirement, or, maybe Australia and maybe not a Jordan. So there are so many unique differences inside of each one of the free trade agreements, which I know causes a lot of heartache for our client base, because everyone wants that blanket statement, wants that one thing that they can for sure apply across the board that says, I know this is the case. A question we also get often is about, what about the forms? What is a country of origin form itself? So really, NAFTA has its own unique form. GSP has what's called the Form A. And then pretty much everything else follows suit with just a standard country of origin certificate. There aren't a lot of rules around what that country of origin certificate needs to look like. Most of the rules are derived around how does your supplier or you as the manufacturer know that this product was made. And that kind of takes us into the bill of material side of this. So when you go and you're ready to qualify something, especially on the export side, that you want to, claim as U.S. origin for a specific free trade agreement, the very first thing you have to do is, you have to get a bill of materials for every part inside of that. And I know a lot of people just decided they were never going to claim a free trade agreement again, because some of these get really long. Inside of that, you'll need to know what the value of each one of those products is. So if you bought it for $3, you need to be able to say that. You need to know the country of origin of each of those individual products, and you need to know the tariff numbers. The reason for that is inside most free trade agreements, there are, it tends to be either a value question, how much value is what's considered originating or non-originating. So a good example would be NAFTA, where most things require 60% U.S. origin items in order to claim NAFTA. Now, there's no, I can't say for sure that every one of them 60%, some are 50, some bump all the way into the 90. So, even inside of each free trade agreement, you can't make a statement that covers everything. There's other things that talk about, well, if you imported this product as HTS X and it turns in, you add this component to other components, and as a whole, they turn into HTSY. Then there's what's sometimes called a tariff shift. And did that tariff shift now allow that product to, you've added enough value to it here in the US that now you can claim a free trade agreement. There are, we've done this for some of our clients. There are other companies that do this, where one of the things that they do is they help companies manage their own free trade agreements. If you're an importer, you have to start soliciting those free trade agreement forms, especially if we're talking NAFTA, on, early in the year. If you're an exporter, you've probably already started getting these solicitations for 2017, because people want to know, am I going to be able to buy from you tomorrow because your product is still eligible, which allows me to import it duty-free? Or for whatever reason, have you made a switch in your purchasing, in your buying, that now says, oh, I used to source this product, from down the street, and now I source this product from Asia, and because of this, the product that I'm selling no longer qualifies. One of the things that we caution a lot of people about is, you as compliance need to work with your purchasing group to understand if there have been any changes inside of that bill of material. It's not a one-time thing. We've seen it before where, a client was always purchasing something and they didn't even realize that a piece which added enough value to throw it out and it could no longer be considered originating, they started importing it 2 years ago, and they didn't realize that that piece went into this item that now they were claiming as free trade agreement. And just because you buy it from someone down the street also doesn't mean that it's U.S. origin. They may have imported it. So that kind of goes back to that burden of proof statement that we talked about, and making sure that, we have, that you understand, and the burden that you guys have to go through and what you have to step through in order to qualify something as part of the free trade agreement.
Yeah, the down the street acquisition of products gets a lot of folks in trouble, because that person that you're buying down the street from, or wherever it might be domestically, could very well be importing the product now as well. It's something that when I worked for an importer, we required manufacturers' affidavits from all of our component part suppliers every single year. Every single year we went out to that component and buyer or supplier and asked where they're purchasing the goods, and to have an affidavit as to the origin. And I can't lie, it happens to I've seen it happen to many of you out there, where you're doing your own. You're shipping to Canada, you're shipping to Mexico, and you get asked to complete a NAFTA certificate of origin for the products that you're selling. And the instinct is that I've assembled this product. This is a U.S.A. product, and I'm going to put U.S.A. on the NAFTA certificate of origin. And I was just in New York a couple weeks ago and visiting with a client that was looking to export for the first time up to Canada, and they got that same question, and they had on a NAFTA certificate of origin, what do I do? I have all these component items that make up this finished piece. And so we started going through them, and we helped them with their imports as well. So I was able to quickly identify that they had parts on there that were not U.S. origin at all. And we went through and started doing the math, and the product wasn't going to qualify for NAFTA. Even though the vendor in Canada, or the customer in Canada, demanded a NAFTA certificate of origin because they wanted the product to be duty-free, it just wasn't going to qualify. And at that point, you have to decline to do the NAFTA certificate of origin, because the product just doesn't qualify for NAFTA in those cases. So we have to be very careful about the component pieces and the math problem that Adam described when it comes to free trade agreements, claiming free trade agreements, and making sure that you're always protecting yourself and your business, regardless of what your client might want on an export situation, and also even on an import situation with a free trade agreement, to make sure they've done their due diligence before declaring where that something is in fact wholly made or does qualify for a free trade agreement upon an import. With that burden of proof, we've seen some very, very complex requests as it comes, especially as it relates to textiles. And there's a question here about textiles their own rules as it relates into most free trade agreements. And it just kind of notes that apparel textiles have own rules due to politicians are scarce of a few southern interest groups that only make yarns and fabrics. And you're spot on. Interest groups do control many of these free trade agreements, and they're trying to protect local industry as it relates. And you're right, textiles are very, very complex as it relates to free trade agreements and that burden of proof. So I thank you for whoever submitted that anonymously for asking that question.
One of the other worries or sometimes things that we see is most free trade agreements have transshipment provisions inside of them that disqualify you from claiming the free trade agreement. So an example would be is you import an item from China that was originally shipped to China from Mexico, and the product was made in Mexico. And if you would have imported it directly from Mexico to the U.S., you would have been able to claim NAFTA. That product not coming directly from Mexico into the U.S. now prohibits you from claiming that free trade agreement. So note that, let me say it again, or maybe in a little bit clearer way, is if you're not importing the product from the exact same country that you're trying to claim the free trade agreement from, 99+% of the time, you cannot claim that free trade agreement. So there are a couple exceptions. One of them is the CAFTA free trade agreement. There are multiple countries there, so customs considers them all one. So in that there may be Nicaragua and Honduras. So maybe the item was made in Honduras, shipped to Nicaragua for something, and then imported. You would still be able to claim in that scenario. But most of them, especially when we do look at NAFTA, it's the biggest offender we see of this group, is that something was shipped to another country and then comes back in as the origin of with Mexican origin, which in theory you'd be able to claim NAFTA, but because it didn't come directly from Mexico, you cannot claim.
Yeah, I've got a good question, Cindy Conway. Great question, and thanks for submitting this question. And we'll get to all of these questions on here. I'm just trying to, because we're already kind of talking about some of these things, I think it fall right in line. Cindy asks, if we had an herbal-based product which was manufactured in the U.S.A., in order to qualify for NAFTA, does each ingredient have to be of U.S. 60% origin?
No is the quick answer to that. And the reason for that is we would have to go through each one of those individual products that go into the final product, figure out what the value is of each of them inside of your end product, what the value what each one of their tariff numbers is as individual items, and then what the value of your finished good is and what the tariff number of that finished good is. And then we could ascertain and make that determination. If you send that to us, both of our emails are up on the screen right now. We'd be happy to take a look at that for you. But sure. Like I said, I need the tariff number of each individual thing that's in there. We need the value of each individual thing that's in there. I need the tariff number of the finished good, whatever you're selling, and the value of that.
And the country of origin of all the other components.
Correct, and the country of origin of each one of those individual components. So those 5 items is what it takes to ascertain whether or not you can qualify. And it's the same, those are the same five for everything. Yeah. It's not just this item. That bill of materials might get longer, but it's the same. Those 5 are the 5 boxes you have to check.
Yeah, and that's something that we always have to be careful for in free trade agreements, to make assumptions maybe even that something has to be, and trust me, I've heard it a million times, that it has to be predominantly of a particular origin. When we look at that final product and the tariff number of the final product, we're going to go to those general notes that Adam had described initially, and we're going to find that tariff number in there, and it's going to tell us what rules we actually have to apply. It's going to tell me that I just need a tariff shift maybe, or it's going to tell me that I need a tariff shift from particular categories, or else it doesn't qualify at all. Or then it might tell me that I can meet a certain regional value content.
Yep.
in order to do the math as it relates to 60%. There's the minima stuff on there of different rules as well. So anyways, it really is a math problem that starts with knowing, one, all the information. But once we have that, we're going to take that final ingredient, say for Cindy here, we're going to take that final product tariff number, and it's going to tell me the rules for all the other ingredients inside of it. And I'm going to follow those rules to make the determination whether that final product would in fact be eligible for NAFTA and or any free trade agreement. The process that we go through is the same. We look at each product individually, and we don't make assumptions as to the percentage, because we might not even have to do a math problem on this at all. It might be clear as day that finished product tariff shifts for all the components. We don't even have to do a math. It doesn't have to reach a certain percentage at all. So anyways, I just want to throw that out there, that those rules are differently. And Cindy, if you want to send that or email us that information, we're happy to do that analysis for you, just to help you out.
And one of the things that you might see there too is it might qualify for NAFTA, but not qualify for another free trade agreement, which I know seems kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people. If it does one, why not another one? One of the things that we tell a lot of our employees when they start the first time is, once you start working in this business, you have to take your common sense hat off and put your customs hat on. And those are two different things. And so free trade agreements are the same way. You have to put your customs hat on in order to do these correctly.
Okay. I've got some more questions. One of them here as it relates to, from anonymous, at TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnerships. When the TPP negotiations are taking place, are the meeting locations rotated in each individual country, or is it all at one neutral country or organization, let's say the WTO? To answer that question, we weren't part of those negotiations. We would have attended had they asked. But anyways, when we had the TPP presenter from the Department of Commerce, she indicated that most of the negotiations were done in Switzerland at the headquarters for the WTO. That's where they went to for most of the negotiations for that. I've got to think that they probably traveled, but I don't have an accurate answer to that. But she did indicate she was back and forth to Europe for most of the negotiations quite often. And then we've got another question. Since England is no longer in the EU, does that mean they are no longer part of TTIP?
I don't know the answer to that. I have a couple of guesses. I believe it's a 3-year process to kind of exit out of the EU for England. And so I don't know if TTIP would get done prior to that, if they would somehow be included, or if they're going to have to renegotiate themselves back in. I don't know for sure.
I'm sure there's language as it relates to the individual countries and something like that. I guess we'll wait and see what the end result is of what happens in England before we really put out an answer of what could be done. Lastly, or another one here is, do these agreements let a company move a factory outside the borders and protections of our democracy and then bring the goods back here to sell?
I don't know if the agreements say you can do that, but yes. So if you're producing a product, here's a good example. If you're producing a product in Kansas City, you could then produce maybe that exact same product. You'd have to kind of work through the rules of origin, but maybe you could do it in Mexico City or in Monterey and then import that product. And that's what we see a lot of companies do is, you have to kind of work through that. My cost to make it here is X. My cost to make it there is Y, and then all of a sudden, then you have to add in, well, what's it going to cost me to get it here? How does that do to my inventory dollars? How much inventory now do I have to worry about that's in transit rather than it's just sitting here? So there's lots of things to take into account of whether or not you're going to change the sourcing of a product. But a lot of times what we see is not as much people moving from the U.S. to another country, but maybe having your sourcing group start to look for those products that you already import and move the sourcing to another country. So, what we've really been seeing in the last couple of years, and as part of the reason that Scarborough, New Mexico was formed, is that we have a lot of clients that had factories in China. And over the past 3 to 5 years, we've really started to see a lot of those factories shift to Mexico. Part of that is because now they can take advantage of NAFTA. So you look at something that was maybe 3% customs duty, and now you're paying 0%. And that 3% off of that makes a big difference when we start talking about the landed cost of your product. you know, especially if you're talking China to Mexico, you do things like you take a 30-day supply chain and you turn it to 7.
Yep.
You know, so how much that's 23 days of inventory that's no longer on the water. So what does that look like in dollars for you? You know, that's just one example, one thing to look at. You know, is transportation cheaper or more expensive? Right now, it'd be hard to say that because, you know, the Far East rates have kind of bottomed out. But, you know, as we see those rates climb back up again, you know, what does the truckload market look like coming out of Mexico City versus a container coming out of Shanghai, China? You know, for a long time, you know, we definitely saw some disparity where Mexico freight inbound was cheaper. As cheap as the rates are right now, that might not necessarily be the case, but those are just a couple of things you have to take into consideration when you're looking at some new sourcing options.
And that's something that Scarborough and our consulting team does all the time for folks, is we come in and we look at products and we look at alternative sourcing options for a company. For example, just like you said, if you're buying plastics from China, could you buy plastics from Thailand to take advantage of GSP?
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things. That's something that our consulting group does all the time, and happy to look at that for any of our clients that are on the call today, is to look for alternative sourcing and where you might be able to take advantage. There's a lot of data out there, a lot of data to be mined, that we can look at to look at your products and compare them to free trade agreement countries and see if maybe you can find a supplier in those countries. Of course, then you always have to weigh the cost of the product and the cost to get it here.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we always that's why we've been seeing more of the nearshoring in Mexico and Canada, as Adam had stated. So again, great question. Here's another one. Can you elaborate more on GSP? What are some of the biggest countries that are part of GSP?
In my mind, you got Thailand and India. Those are the two big ones. Mm-hmm. You know, India produces massive amounts of goods that the U.S. buys. Thailand's another one. Those are two of the largest ones, especially from a trading partner perspective and how much we import from them. But, you know, like I said on GSP, is note that you can't count on it. You know, I think GSP expires again sometime in 2017, if memory serves. I think October of 17, if memory serves me right. Maybe it's December. But what we'll be watching for as we kind of lead up to that is, does Congress allow GSP to continue for X number of years forward? And that's what it's always relying on, is Congress making that move and saying, yes, we're going to authorize GSP again, or no, we're not. The last time we went for a year and a half, almost 2 years, I believe, that everyone was paying duties, and then they retroactively reinstated it and everybody got them back. So, you know, that's something that you can't count on. And you also can't count on that if it goes away, that it is going to be either A, reinstated at all, or even if it is, are they going to do it retroactively? So that's the one concern that we have in general about GSP, is really the inconsistencies in how often in just the past couple of years we've seen it start and stop.
Yeah, it's not easy to get GSP renewed. For one, it's a piece of legislation that cannot move through on its own. So it needs a miscellaneous trade bill, or it needs to be attached to another vehicle through the legislature, which means another bill of some sort. Mm-hmm. And it often gets tagged as an earmark, and which has been a big no-no in Congress for a while, as they've tried to cut down on the number of earmarks, and GSP is often identified as one of those items. So typically it takes a miscellaneous trade bill of some sort, and we know that we work with our legislators and many of the industries that we're a part of and that our clients are a part of, to make sure that they're protected and that they get that renewed just as soon as possible. Because in many times it's the livelihood of their business. I have numerous clients that import large quantities from Thailand, India, those kinds of things, and taking advantage of GSP. And when that goes away and they're paying duties and taxes, their products are no longer as competitive. So they do rely on those types of things, and they work again hard with their legislators to try to get that passed. And we've been lucky that even with the lapses, that it did renew retroactively, mm-hmm. to make some of those countries whole again. So I'm pleased with it for that. Another question here is, what documentation is required for an audit of FTA shipments / entries? Good question.
Well, we have to look at this from two different sides. One is an importer and one is an exporter. So if we look at it from the exporter side, You need to have the bill of materials that has country of origin, that has values, that has tariff numbers going into that final product. So, if you have that, then it's very simple to walk through and show the rest of that math problem and show how you came to the conclusion that you came to as far as if something did or did not qualify for, especially we're looking at like NAFTA. That's the one I talk about a lot. That's just the easiest one to talk about. It's the one that the majority of people take advantage of the most is NAFTA. I think it's probably the one that's incorrectly claimed the most as well. So from both sides. As an importer, you have to be able to prove that you have done some form of due diligence with your supplier that says, yes, you agree. So maybe your sales group visits these factories. Maybe you visit these factories, sit down and have the conversation of, the U.S. gets kind of picky about this stuff because, customs, part of their job after protecting our borders is to protect the revenue of the United States. And this obviously cuts into the revenue of the United States when we claim free trade agreements. So just kind of know that. And so when you're there, ask them questions like, well, where did this product come from? And you don't have to ask them for things like, well, how much did you buy it for? Or who'd you buy it from? Because they're probably not going to give that to you because they want to still be involved. Now, some of them certainly will, not all of them. But, I think for the most part, in that scenario, be able to prove that you've done some kind of due diligence with that supplier in order to make sure that you believe that you would be confident in making that claim based on the documents they've provided you.
Good. How, anonymous viewer, again, this is probably a bit of a loaded question here. How do you interpret rules of origin?
Very carefully is probably the best answer to that question. I think that would be what we would need a little bit more info. Which free trade agreement are we talking about? I know we're kind of beating a dead horse here, but it's definitely about each individual free trade agreement, and you have to make that distinction on every one.
I think it is. It's going back to the tariff and the individual free trade agreement and identifying the specific HTS number that you need to know the rule on.
Right.
I mean, that really is rules of origin because that identifies specifically what rules need to be met for the finished good and or goods with any other component item along with those notes as it relates to the specific origin of the product. So I wish it was easy and I wish they were all the same. That would make our job very, very easy, but I guess I'll call it job security and the fact that we spend a lot of time going through rule of origin exercises, and our consulting team does this all day long, is do those specific things. So we're happy to chat offline. Again, you can email us specifically and we can engage you. And if you're looking at a specific free trade agreement, I'm happy to spend a little time maybe giving you some tips and so forth of what you might, what that might mean. Here's another question. I'll move on to Gina. Gina, you've asked some great questions. In regards to NAFTA, I find that they are much more particular in how the NAFTA looks and its format when shipping to Mexico than when I ship to Canada. Why is this? It's the same form, same products in most cases, but Mexico is very picky in what information needs to be on there. Well said.
Yeah, very well said.
Adam, I mean, we've been dealing with this for quite a while now.
Yeah, and it's been, from going from just being, a service provider on one side to being a service provider on both sides of the border down there, we've definitely seen this as well. And one of the things there's a couple things I can say about this. So there's actually a proper way and an improper way to fill out an NAFTA form. There are minor things like the tariff number only needs to be 6 digits, not 10. And there are things like that Canada tends not to care about. Even though the form might not be correct as far as did I fill it out, they only put 6 instead of 10 or things like that, Canada is not overly concerned. The U.S. tends not to be either with what's going on there when it comes down to some of those minor things. Because to them, it's like, well, you gave me all 10, I only need 6, it's not a big deal. Thanks for giving me more information. When we start to look at Mexico, Mexico is kind of an odd thing to say, but when it comes to this, they are very much a rule follower. So if it says X, you have to do X. We've seen more free trade agreement or more NAFTAs returned for the 10 versus the 6. And all they had to do was take those last 4 off, and all of a sudden the NAFTA went through without a problem. One of the other issues we see a lot, especially at the southern border, is that brokers will claim that the government is telling them things that is not actually happening. That is one of probably the most common things that we see, is that it's not Mexican customs claiming that they need to update something. It's maybe that broker. The reason for that is, and the reason for also a lot of the stringent pushback on NAFTAs going into Mexico, is the fact that in the United States, even though you hire a broker, you as the importer are ultimately liable for what's happening. In Mexico, the customs broker is liable. So that changes my view too, because if you guys are providing Scarborough information in the United States, we're going to do our best job to make sure that, yeah, this looks right, everything is done. But customs says ultimately it's still on you. In Mexico, the Mexican Customs Department says, no, it's on you, Scarborough. You have to make sure this is right. So a lot of times that's why you get a lot of pushback, because NAFTA is the largest free trade agreement that sits inside of the tariff, from just a thickness and number of pages to read. And there is some gray, there is some interpretation that has to be done. And you look at Laredo alone, there are 700 and some odd customs brokers, freight forwarders in Laredo with us. And so that's 700 and some odd different interpretations of the exact same thing. And so you're going to see some differences. We've seen it a lot too. Product going to Mexico tends to deliver to Laredo and then you're done. And so what happens when when you're doing that, you're delivering to your customer's Mexican customs broker. It might be 7 different people, and you might have 7 different people telling you they want something different on an NAFTA form. I'm sure if I could see you all instead of just a camera, I'd see a lot of heads nodding right now, because it's something that we see all the time and it's something that we deal with. So, that is one of the biggest reasons, I guess, in my opinion, that Mexico really does that, and you get a lot more pushback. 90+% of the time, it's not from customs, it's from the broker. Now, they're going to tell you it's from customs because that tends to be the claim. Everyone tends to listen more when they say, hey, the government's telling me this, not just me. But it's normally that broker wanting to make sure that they have all their own I's dotted and T's crossed.
And one of the things that we've been encouraging our clients that ship to Mexico clients to do is let Scarborough. Let us be the broker, get us and introduce us to your client. Let us be the broker on the Mexico side. Because then if we're working with you and your Mexican broker, you're going to know exactly the right way to do that NAFTA. And it's going to be the same every single time. Because when you're dealing with a different client, with a different broker, and they have different rules every single time, you chase your tail. And that's kind of what Adam said, is that it's the stickiness of one, making sure we do it exactly the same way and the right way going into to Mexico for the liability of us, the broker. But anyways, you're gonna know how to do it the exact same way. So might throw in a plug for Scarborough de Mexico there. Here's another question, and I don't know the answer to this. Regarding the Korea Free Trade Agreement, what is the primary difference between the WO classification and the PE classification?
We will do a little bit of research and get back to you. I don't know that off the top of my head, but we will follow up with emails to out to everybody with some of these. If we did have an answer, we will go ahead and put it out there for everyone to see.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, in the gotten some great questions, and we've only got about 8 minutes left or so in today's. And one of the things is if I'm virtually walking away from this webinar, what are the takeaway points that stem out of the agreements that level the playing field for easy and accessible transactions-based operations between business, big or small, in addition to tariff reductions?
I'm sorry, I'm reading the question as well here just to make sure.
I guess what are the takeaways and the advantages of using the free trade agreements?
I think the biggest advantage is it makes you more competitive, and I think that's the whole idea behind it. It allows you to lower that cost of your product, and then you get to make that business decision of whether or not you are going to pass those savings on to your client, whether you're going to use them to increase your own bottom line, or somewhere as a combination of the two, maybe a 3% reduction, you pass on a 1.5% savings and you keep the other 1.5%. So, that in my mind is where those things come from, because it doesn't really reduce, there's a lot of comment of, well, this reduces trade barrier. And I think that's somewhat misleading, because your product still clears U.S. customs. Your product still clears foreign customs. It still goes through the same process. And actually, a lot of the times now, because we are claiming free trade agreements, the compliance becomes more stringent. So does it reduce trade barriers as in you can source products at the same duty rates in multiple countries? Absolutely. But it doesn't reduce the compliance side. In fact, it probably increases the amount of compliance that's required in order to claim them and claim those benefits.
Yeah, and in my opinion on such a thing for takeaways is free trade agreements. Historically, we've done free trade agreements with smaller countries. People say it's the U.S.'s opportunity to bully a small country, those kinds of things, whatever it might be. But free trade agreements, the average duty rate in the U.S. is low, right? 3% or less, 2.5%.
So
the average duty rate in most other countries is double digits. So when we do a free trade agreement, we give free trade, we lower the barrier by 3%, but we get double-digit relief in most cases, in most of those countries that we do free trade agreements with. So the barriers to enter as far as the duty savings and so forth for U.S.-made products drops dramatically when we do a free trade agreement with another country. Along with that, every free trade agreement has those rules regarding labor standards, environmental standards, intellectual property rights standards. We ask for improvements in every country we do a free trade agreement with to set a standard relating to all of those types of things. So in a sense, we are forcing our will, our democracy on some of those countries to get them to perform and act a little more like we are and raise their standards for making products. But in return, it gives us access to those countries at a much lower rate. And so many of these free trade agreements, the TPP in particular, which hopefully will pass, it gets rid of some barriers, some taxation barriers in some complex countries as well, not just the duties, but some of the other taxes that relates to imported goods also. So I think the takeaway for me with free trade agreements is one is that we're trying to improve the standards, and we're actually lowering our barrier if we are in fact exporting to that country instead of our goods being double-digit duties. Now sometimes they'll go back to where they're free in those countries as well, and we lose very little by importing products from those countries. Like I say, if we're losing less than 3%, and our products now can be imported at a much higher rate, it's really helping. And we are again a heartland business. We're here in the Midwest, the heartland of the United States. We have a lot of crops, a lot of farms, a lot of pork products and things like that. And that's products that benefit greatly from going to these foreign countries and opening up exports. So throughout here, exports are very, very popular, and these free trade agreements help us get into those countries. So that's what I think are the benefits, both big and small, for businesses, not just the tariff reduction, but some other things. Susan's got a question, and another good one. Is one more legal or valid when it comes to certificates versus affidavits?
Well, I'm going to kind of go out, and I think the question is here, you have certificate of origin. You heard Kevin talk a little bit about, manufacturer's affidavits and things like that. And so I think it's more of a combination of the two rather than an either or scenario, because in order to claim, you do need some kind of certificate of origin, or you have to provide that to someone. The affidavit comes more in, that goes back to that due diligence that we talked about. What else have you done? Do you have another thing that they've given you that says, you know what, I signed this, I did this, I made this. It's something that we see often, those of you who maybe export your product and then want to bring it back into the United States, use one of those Chapter 98 tariff number. we might be asking you as the importer, hey, will you fill out the manufacturer's affidavit so we can go ahead and claim and get you duty-free status on U.S. origin product that's coming back into the United States. So I think that is much more of a both question rather than an either or question.
I agree. I know that, again, when I was working on the import side of things, we wouldn't do a certificate of origin for the export of our product if it contained components that we didn't have an affidavit from the person that actually made the component. So we were looking as the affidavit as building up our case of why we declared this particular thing on a certificate of origin, is that someone told me specifically, my vendor down the street told me that he makes this product at his location. Maybe I've been there and I had him sign it while I was there. Those are great things to have, that you actually saw them produce it, and I've got an affidavit from him, which is a legal document stating that he made this item. And therefore, when I do my certificate of origin to export this product, I declare that with confidence that the origin of my product, again, using the rules of origin for my finished good, that I've got affidavits to back that up. So I think it's just building your burden of proof, which I think is one of those things that you want to do if you're exporting goods and or if you're importing goods, is make sure that you're protected. I will tell you that another thing that we've seen is, and maybe go back to that audit question, is textiles. I've imported textiles from CAFTA countries for a long time. I've had U.S. Customs go down to my client's factory and validate that these products were being made in his factory. And then I've had Customs here in the United States ask me for proof. And I was like, you were just there. I have a form. I even did a Freedom of Information Act request to get a copy of their report that they were there, to prove to Customs that they were at this location. And then we went back to the manufacturer, and we had all that. We had all of the required documents for textiles. We had pull tickets. We had timesheets of employees that were working on it, the schedules, the fabrics, where the fabrics came in, all of the import documents for some of the fabrics from CAFTA countries, and things like that. So we had all of our proof. And in addition, we requested the report from Customs that they were at this facility, so we could prove and make our case to justify that and feel that burden of proof that these goods actually did qualify for CAFTA. And Customs approved our request. We submitted it. It all looked good, but we went that extra mile to make sure of it, because Customs has the right to challenge it. And I won't lie, it probably took 3 months to gather all of the data for all of the different SKUs over a long period of time that Customs asked for. But we were able to fulfill the requirement, work with our client to get all of that information and get it submitted and get it all approved to where they wouldn't have any problems with further declaring that their products as qualifying under the CAFTA free trade agreement. So anyways, it was complex and it was difficult. It was fun. I can't lie, it was fun. I'm just a nerd like that. But anyways, there's those are things that you can happen when it comes to the burden of proof that's on there. And I'm noting that it's 2:30. I think we've got through most of the submitted questions, and in consideration for your time, we're going to end the webinar. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending. I would like to thank each and every one of you for the great questions, for my colleague Adam and his input on this webinar. Again, this webinar will be sent out to all of you in attendance, along with links to the presentation, and which has links to the specific free trade agreements. Our contact information is on there. We can't say enough that we're available for your questions after this event and any time between this event and our next webinar as well. So please feel free to email us your questions, call us, whenever you need our help. That's what we're here for. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.